Yes, exposition. Because everyone just loves that giant text opening in the original Star Wars, or was completely captivated by the giant info dump at the start of Lord of the Rings. Okay, those visuals are pretty stunning, and that made that a lot more bearable.
But my point remains valid.
Exposition is one of those pendulums, swinging back and forth, and a lot of writers struggle to find that happy medium. After all, if you rely on the good old show don't tell, you'd think there would be absolutely no room for exposition. But if you leave too many details out, the audience gets confused, and everything starts to feel like you're talking to one of those cashiers at a magical new age crystal shop. While this issue is something that plagues my genre of urban fantasy, the sci-fi and high fantasy bookshelves are loaded with history lessons poorly disguised as prologues. So let's ask today's guest, fantasy and sci-fi author Karl K Gallagher, why this is a problem. Okay, you've been writing a wee bit longer than I. You've got how many books out now?
At this point, I have 13 books, two story collections, and 11 novels in three different series.
And one of those
I,
is actually set as like a trilogy pack. Like you could actually purchase the
mm,
whole set either in Audible or as a book by itself, right?
yes, I have the Torchip trilogy available as an omnibus, which is this, you know, huge brick of paper, or a rather long audiobook. And I will say, people's eyes light up when I tell them 38 hours for one Audible credit. So that seems to have been a fairly good decision to do it that way.
What does Expedition do for a story, both good and bad, just knowing story that widely?
Well, pretty much exposition is when you need some information in the story for people to understand what's going on, but it's something that you don't want to play out as interaction among the characters because it would be either, take too long or would just be boring to recite. I mean, I think that the classic thing is, okay, the character, your adventurers spend 2 weeks going through the marshes until you get to town. Do you, have a whole chapter of them struggling through the mud and the mosquitoes, or do you just have them coming through the door of the tavern covered with mud and then stick in a paragraph or two about how miserable the swamps were?
Right.
So the second option is putting in exposition. And there's this classic, show don't tell thing, which is essentially saying don't do exposition. But the trade-off is, do you want to have, in your 6 book fantasy series, do you want one of those books to be about them going to the swamp, or do you want to skip that and get to the fun stuff?
Mm.
Exposition is what lets you get to the fun stuff. The danger is when you have too much exposition or handle it badly. There is a phrase: the writer has done the research, and now you have to suffer too.
That's something I think a lot of videos try to tackle is that there's this balance between the clunky exposition where the characters are saying something that really they should already know just for the audience's sake, or better yet, there's a narrator just explaining outright. But if you take that away in its entirety and you just try show everything, it's at some point you're showing your characters going to the bathroom. We don't need to know that. So there is this balancing act, is kind of what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, and sometimes it can be done well, it can be done badly. Um, I was actually looking through some of my stories, and I have an alternate history space station story,
Uh-huh.
and that just pretty much opens with a huge chunk of exposition because it's kind of the narrator saying, well, thank God for this NASA mission, because otherwise Skylab would have re-entered and the space station and the space shuttle wouldn't have had any place to go, and we'd have
Right.
to build a new space station from scratch, and that's
Mhm.
so it's a bunch of exposition, but I think I managed to do it entertainingly enough, and alternate history readers are kind of looking for what's the story of this world.
Right.
And someone who's picking up a swords and sorcery novel is looking for action, not the story of a world. So it's very much audience dependent.
Right, because there is also exposition, like if we don't just look at your genre and my genre, because I do urban fantasy, and you obviously have to explain what's different between Chicago and Chicago with wizards. End of story. That's just, you have to. But if you look at, like, say, a mystery story, there's still going to be exposition about how they find the clues, da 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 da, and how this adds up. Like you said, it's about how do you play to that audience and that entertainment. Actually, I don't read high fantasy often. You know, I've talked about this a couple times. It's just not my strawberry rhubarb jam. But your book, Lost Wars, the exposition was so well constructed. Like, you had me learning the way that the orcs breed, which, by the way, and learning how people had to fish it without current technology. And it was so eloquent. It was so well threaded into your story. I feel like it kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi'd me with this stuff.
Some of the techniques there are, you have a character who doesn't understand this and so has to be lectured. So my story, The Lost War, had some historical reenactor types sucked into a fantasy world by an evil spell where they deal with horrible monsters, including orcs who essentially reproduce like parasitic wasps. And so there's this scene where their doctor is explaining to the guy in charge what's going on, and he's freaking out. And so I have this character who's the audience stand in, but it doesn't bother people because he actually in world would not know this stuff.
Right.
And so you need to have a good audience stand-in figure if you're going to deliver your exposition and dialogue. Luke Skywalker was this rural bumpkin who knew nothing. He knew absolutely nothing except if he went to the Imperial Academy, they'd let him fly spaceships. And he thought that was cool.
Right.
And then he gets Obi-Wan lecturing him on the Force and Imperial atrocities and all sorts of stuff. So Luke got to be the audience stand-in to let that information get conveyed.
As per usual, we have our 3 movie clips to help us explore this topic in depth. Though, you are my first guest that picked all 3 clips. You owe me a drink over Dune. You absolutely do. But let's go ahead and get started with that. The 1984 Dune.
A beginning is a very delicate time. Know then that it is the year 10,191. The known universe is ruled by the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, my father. In this time, the most precious substance in the universe is the spice melange. The spice extends life. The spice expands consciousness. The spice is vital to space travel. The Spacing Guild and its navigators, who the spice has mutated over 4,000 years, use the orange spice gas, which gives them the ability to fold space. That is, travel to any part of the universe without moving. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you. The spice exists on only one planet in the entire universe. A desolate, dry planet with vast deserts. Hidden away within the rocks of these deserts are a people known as the Fremen, who have long held a prophecy that a man would come, a Messiah, who would lead them to true freedom. The planet is Arrakis, also known as Dune.
Dune's an amazing book with a hell of a lot of backstory, and Herbert did an exposition technique that a lot of writers may want to pick up. I should probably try this myself sometimes. each chapter starts with a little snippet from some in-universe book. So you just have a one line or a paragraph or something by a book written in the future of this setting, providing information on what's going on.
Like when you open up a research book or a quotations book, sometimes they have like little snippets from like the Bible or whatever at the beginning of each chapter, kind of like that.
So like that, except fictional books. And I will actually open some of my books with quote. The last one I published had a Tom Paine quote as its opener. Frank Herbert did that with fictional books within his setting. Now, David Lynch, looking at this very backstory heavy book and wanting to turn it into the movie, had the problem of how do I get people up to speed without spending half an hour of people doing stuff. And he chose the rather questionable brute force solution of just putting a talking head in front of the audience, lecturing us on the backstory of the setting.
Right.
Which I think is kind of very much not the way to do it. And particularly, don't start out that way. Okay, David Lynch maybe knew, they already bought their ticket. They're sitting in the theater. They're trapped. I have them. They're not going to make a break for it. So he made them sit through several minutes of this.
Oh no, it's not just that. It's also the fact that he sits there and not only does he do that, he teases you several times by having her face fade out so you think it's finally over.
And then she comes back and it's like, oh, and I forgot, and lectures you some more, which is, probably might have had some people standing up from their seats and moving to the aisle. Nowadays, there's a hell of a lot more competition for people's attention. You need to start with a hook. You need to grab people. You need them have not just action, not just a fight, but a fight where they care who wins.
Right.
And so, just starting out with a lecture, generally a bad idea unless you can make the lecture entertaining.
After that little train wreck, let's have a nice little palate cleanser with the opening to Serenity.
Earth that was could no longer sustain our numbers. We were so many. We found a new solar system. Dozens of planets and hundreds of moons. Each one terraformed, a process taking decades to support human life. But the Alliance's victory over the Independents ensured a safer universe. And now, everyone can enjoy the comfort and enlightenment of true civilization.
We meddle.
River?
People don't like to be meddled with. We tell them what to do, what to think. We're in their homes and in their heads.
River. We're not telling people what to think. We're just trying to show them how.
Now, Serenity dumps a whole bunch of information on the viewers all at once. You've got the escape from Earth, you've got colonizing new worlds, you've got the Civil War. Kind of the sugar that makes all of this medicine go down is that you have lovely images illustrating it. So you essentially are getting the show rather than just the tell. Then it wraps up with this little reveal that the lecture you're getting actually is a lecture to a student who is someone we identify with, and if you'd seen the series before this movie, you really liked River. And then you flip out of that to realize that this is a memory being triggered by River as she's undergoing medical experimentation. People complain about head-hopping changes in points of view, but this is actually a master class on how to repeatedly change point of view in the course of it, because you go from the opening visuals to the classroom to the medical lab to revealing that this is a recording of the escape from the medical lab, and then switch to Mal Reynolds on Serenity. And so that's a whole lot of point of view hopping handled masterfully.
Yeah, it's a little bit like a exposition inception, if you will. It just keeps layering and layering and layering. Now, since most of the audience that's going to be watching this are writers, how do you manage to do something this masterful without necessarily having a screen to compensate for that?
Well, I mean, you can describe stuff in words. For example, part of the exposition in the Serenity opening is you get to see the operative, and it's like, ooh, we have this tough, competent guy who intends to hunt down and capture River. And so you can describe this guy and that he looks calm and cool and then proceeds to engage in an act of cruelty, essentially murdering, this guy and forcing him to pretend it's a suicide.
Right.
And, you know, having a compassionate tone of voice saying, this is a good death, this is a man's death. And so that brings out the character. And you can do that in words. You could put that in words saying, as the doctor lay there bleeding out, impaled on the sword, he whispered compassionately into his ear.
Right.
So that's something you can describe, rather than doing the high school history book method of just time place name, here's where the battles were.
Right.
uh,
That's what's so funny. Like in my opening, I actually was making fun of the fact that a lot of books, will open up with this very poorly disguised history lesson that's basically a prologue. I think the only one that I found that's done it well was Harry Potter. And it entertained the hell out of me when I watched this clip, and I'm like, that's right. There's a literal history lesson at the beginning of this movie, which is heralded as one of the lost sci-fi gems as far as like Firefly ending way too soon. So rules are meant to be broken.
to toss in another movie reference, it's more like guidelines than rules. It's not that you have to obey the rules, it's that when you break them, you should do it on purpose rather than by accident.
Right. You should
So,
understand their purpose so that you know where to bend and where to just snap it and
yeah.
call it a day. And
And
that kind of leads us to the whole thing about perspective in a sense, because the final one that you asked me to look at, which was very interesting by the way, I'd never thought of this as exposition, is this nifty opening from Lord of War. Which, apologies to the audience in advance, I will have to remove the music because otherwise YouTube will actually slam me.
so Lord of War is the story of an arms smuggler after the fall of the Soviet Union. This opening is showing you how the process of Soviet weaponry getting to the third world works, in that you see a weapon, in this case just a single bullet, being made, and then it's processed in the factory, it's put into the crate, it goes through paperwork on the Russian end, goes on the ship, is taken to the third world, there's you know gets through customs there, and is then brought out to the people fighting their civil war, and the bullet is shot into the forehead of some poor teenager who probably barely knows why the hell this fight is going on in the first place.
Right.
And so it's very much showing you there's all of this stuff being made by habit from the what's left over from the Soviet complex, and it's being dumped into this and increasing the lethality of these third world wars. And then you draw out, and here's the guy who's making this happen and profiting from that whole chain.
It does so much. It's kind of the old idea, like someone says, "Oh, if this thing could tell its stories," they talk about if an airplane could tell stories, if whatever, right? And in this case, they actually are letting the bullet tell the story, along with some questionable CGI, but I'll let that go. Um, but yeah, it does definitely lead you into this world of like, this is how far this thing is going. It feels like an inanimate object, but in the end, it has a life of its own, and this is who's giving it that life.
And you can use an inanimate object as your point of view character, um, which I actually did in my first book. There was a little scene where something gets dropped into the engine to destroy it, because this is not one of those fragile engines that will break apart if a bird hits it. I have a spaceship engine that can handle getting some junk tossed into it, and it just melts the junk down to atoms. And so I follow through, and this was partly exposition and trying to say, okay, you knowledgeable about rocket readers, I'm showing you the hardware of this ship so you will know that I know my stuff. Similarly, in The Lost War, which is aimed at historical reenactors, I had a little scene early on where people are setting up a primitive tent, just wooden canvas. That was kind of me saying to the Ren Fair people and the SCA people and other reenactors, I've done this. I know what I'm talking about. You can work exposition better if you're combining it with something else. And that's just sort of a subset of a general rule, which is any scene should be achieving more than one thing for the story.
I always like to ask, what is one takeaway that you'd like to give the writers or the audience when it comes to this topic, exposition? What's something that would help them kind of just hone in and maybe not get so overwhelmed by all the, frankly, bullshit they're going to see online?
Only put in exposition for what the readers know, not all the stuff that you want to share. Tolkien had appendices at the end of The Lord of the Rings with, here's Aragorn's family tree, here's Aragorn's romance with Arwen, here's the backstory on what was going on with the dwarves at the Misty Mountain during the rest of this stuff. And there is a temptation to, I have all of this wonderful backstory, put it in the story, and putting everything in, that's probably more than the audience needs to know.
Move it along, people. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. And thank you for forcing me to see part of Dune. I'm going to get you back to that. Do us all a favor and give us some exposition on where people can find you and your fantastic books.
All right. Well, the easiest way to find me is at Gallagher Stories on Substack. I put up a short story every month, which you're welcome to check out. I also have 13 books available on Amazon, and some of them are on Audible. And you are welcome. And I will have another one coming out this year. The novel War by Other Means, number 7 in the Fall of the Censors series, is in the hands of my editor, and so should be going up for sale soon.
Thank you again to today's guest, author Karl K Gallagher, for his expertise on exposition. All the links to his work will be down below. And don't forget, if you enjoy these interviews and video essays, please make sure that you're liking, commenting, subscribing, and most importantly, sharing. At the time I'm filming this, I am just barely creeping up on 100 subscribers, so everything you do makes such a huge difference. And if you want to support my work more directly, you can check out the first 4 chapters of Blood Herring here on YouTube completely free. This supports not only me, but also my audiobook narrators, Dallin and Kennedy Bradford. Thank you so much, and happy writing.